Hey, good morning to this morning's ACEC Design Environmental Discussion Series. We've already had one of these before, and we have another one next week, which will let you know a little bit more about where you can access and also about where you can find that one coming up. My name is Chris Goodson. I'm the GDOT Ecology Section Manager, or Co-Section Manager, along with Dave Hedin, who you'll be hearing from later today. And I'd like to give you a little bit of housekeeping rules as we move forward. If you joined anonymously, you will not show up in our engagement report. In that case, you can either sign out and sign back in with your name, or you can put your name and email into the Q&A, and we will take your name down there. You will submit all questions via the Q&A box, and you can see a simulation of that over on the right side of your screen. All microphones will be muted for the entire time today. So please ask any questions you have in the Q&A box, and we will either answer live during the event, or we will write you a response, or there's an opportunity to access Q&A at the end if there are any questions that we don't get to during the session. If you choose to submit a question, you can do that by putting your name in. You can also submit a question anonymously, even if you've signed in with your own name. So please ask as many questions. We'd love to hear from you. And type your questions at any time. This is a live event, which means there's a little bit of a lag. So if you're asking a question, it's probably going to take 30 or so seconds for us to get to it. So ask questions as they come up during the session, and we'll get to them during our Q&A period. The session is being recorded and will be available after the presentation. So you will have access to this, and others will as well. We are also giving out any PDH or CEU credits to those attending the entire session. To get those, we need you to email Gail Davino by July 30th to request a certificate and include the name as you'd like it to appear on the certificate, as well as your employer. Those housekeeping items out of the way, I would like to talk a little bit about today's topics and presenters. I will be going into our first session, which is on the Joint Coordination Procedures, which is a streamlining process agreement with our Federal Highway Administration and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as Georgia Department of Natural Resources, Wildlife Resources Division. We will then be hearing from Dave Hedin, Brad McManus, and Sarah Jones on the Ecology Post-Construction Stormwater Report. And initially, these may seem a little bit incongruent, one being really species related, the other being really focused on water quality, but we hope to tie those together as we go through the presentations. We'll have a wrap up and key takeaways for each session, and then after each session, we'll also have a Q&A. And if at the end, if we have any time left and we didn't get to any questions, then we will do the Q&A then as well for all sessions with all presenters. Without further ado, I'd like to jump into the Joint Coordination Procedures. The Joint Coordination Procedures, again, is something, is an agreement that we signed into with Federal Highway and Fish and Wildlife back in 2002, and it was amended back, or 2003 actually, and amended in 2007. We've had another amendment in 2018, and then finally, again, after years of work by a lot of different people, we had it amended again in January 27th, 2021. And the reason it's worth noting is because a lot has changed in this agreement. And it's not, while it's an ecology-based agreement, it really has implications for all offices, especially for program delivery in terms of recovering schedules or getting ahead in schedules, but also for designers, because we rely a lot on designers to be able to implement some of the things that make this agreement so great for us. As I mentioned, we've got a new signatory with this new agreement, which is Georgia Department of Natural Resources, Wildlife Resources Division. They primarily are responsible for our state protected species. And so now we have an agreement that covers not only our federal species, but our state species as well. In terms of the regulatory coverage, a lot has changed as well. We always have covered the Endangered Species Act, and we always have had a no effect, a programmatic no effect option, informal Section 7, and formal Section 7. But you can see, based on the things in blue here, these are things that are added with the new 2021 JCP. To that, we have added a procedure for reinitiation of Section 7 consultation. And this is really critical because it means that we have a process with our agencies for how we move through a reevaluation of our projects, and it really streamlines that. We'll get more into that, but it also lays out a very clear process for early coordination and for requesting technical assistance from our agencies. And that's really critical as well as we get into the planning phases of our projects. We have also added in the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. That's something that we recently, Dave Fedin has put a lot of effort into coming up with an agreement with APHIS and streamlining that, but we wanted to document that, as well as our Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act procedures. And as I mentioned, we wanted to cover our state laws, the Georgia Wildflower Preservation Act and Georgia Endangered Wildlife Act. So this is a very comprehensive act, and if you are familiar with the local coordination procedures, or the LCP, that really focuses on the water side, and the JCP is really on the species side of things. So that's a good way to think about that division. For the practitioners that may be attending today's call, it's really important to focus on Appendix B of the agreement. Of course, you're welcome to access and view the entire agreement. If you look at the GDOT Environmental Guidebook page and go into the Ecology section, the Joint Coordination Procedures is an attachment to that page. And the guidebooks there are really an incredible effort by a lot of people and a great resource as you're trying to work through your projects, whether you're an ecologist or anybody just trying to understand the process better. But Appendix B, those standard operating procedures, is really where we focused in on speaking to the practitioners and how we can really walk them through the process all the way from early coordination, that desktop review, into field surveys, to the documentation, and then agency consultation. So focus your time there, and it's really meant to be for practitioners to walk step by step through, not as some administrative agreement previously that most people hadn't read most of. So let's talk about early coordination, and we're going to walk through the process, the plan development process as it relates to ecology. Early coordination, when should it happen? It should happen at the very beginning of resource identification and prior to conducting any field surveys. And the reason that is because we need to get a species list of all the federal and state species that we need to address during our report. But we also need to reevaluate projects every time we need to get that species list and make sure it's up to date every time we reevaluate a project. And so it's really important that we pull the early coordination at that time as well to make sure that we are absolutely current. Now, the way that we do that is primarily through two main programs. The first is NARGIS, which is the Georgia Natural Archaeological Historical Resource GIS. And we will be asking for rare occurrences of species within 3 miles of the environmental survey boundary, but that's also going to include any aquatic species that may be known within the HUC 10, which is just a smaller watershed than the HUC 8s that we sometimes use. With IPAC, that's going to be how we get our species list from Fish and Wildlife Service. And it's going to be any species ranges that happened across our environmental survey boundary. We are no longer using county lists in almost all cases. There are some projects where we may still use that, but primarily we're using that environmental survey boundary and uploading it in. And there's a lot of functionality associated with that we'll talk about with IPAC. That's really, I think, a pretty neat advantage of using IPAC in those ESB files. And we do that by uploading the ESB to both NARGIS and IPAC. So as we think through how to get our species list, we really want to be pulling state species from NARGIS list. Apologies. And we will be pulling the federal species from IPAC. So you can see here that on the state side, on NARGIS, it actually pulls a federal species that's not listed on IPAC, and therefore that's a species we would not address in our documentation. So really important to get your species list, state species from NARGIS, federal species from IPAC. But then there's going to be project specific recommendations as well. And those are primarily going to come from NARGIS. It's going to be very specific to your project, and that comes from Georgia Department of Natural Resources, Wildlife Resources Division, WRD. And they will, once you submit an official NARGIS request, they will give you those official recommendations for your project. And they're going to be adding things in the future to that, things like wildlife vehicle conflict data, so that we know when we need to be addressing that as well on projects. But Fish and Wildlife has gone to the effort for every single HUC 10. They have made project-specific recommendations, and that's going to include any potential species that has a range that crosses that HUC 10. So even if you don't have a federal species on your species list, but it is in the HUC 10, that doesn't mean you need to address it. It just means that if it happens to be on your species list, then you've got recommendations right there for that species. So let's talk about the field surveys. With the field surveys, what's new? Well, the FHWA SOP requires an assessment of wildlife passage. And what we really are going to be looking there are barriers to passage, both aquatic and terrestrial. Now that could be a perched culvert. That could also be if you have a bridge that just has riprap on the entire underside and no real area for terrestrial wildlife to cross underneath. And to do that, in our documentation and our AOEs and our resource survey reports, we will want to take pictures of the culvert inlet and outlet. And this is going to be really important to tell our agencies the current existing condition of our structures. This is something they've been pushing for a long time, and something that they're going to have a lot more feedback on. And so from a design perspective, that's something that we really want to be paying attention to, because there are design implications for perched culverts as well. And it may be a consideration and a conversation to be had early on about whether that's a structure we want to extend or one we want to replace. And so definitely want to be having that conversation early on. Even if it's not feasible, we need to be able to justify why not. Now, along with the JCP came a number of new templates. And the first of those is when we have fairly minor project activities. And these are a lot of our maintenance projects, some of our quick response projects, things like that. And those can use the programmatic assessment worksheet. You can see an example of what that programmatic assessment worksheet here at the bottom of the screen. And it's just super easy, asking just some basic questions, filling out a table essentially. And we transmit that, and then we are done. But we have also updated our Ecology Resource Survey and Assessment of Effect Report, General and Minor Report templates. And the big change there is that we've added in a section on action area, so that we're not just assessing what the potential impacts are to the area within the environmental survey boundary, but also a mile outside of that environmental survey boundary in most cases, sometimes further than that, say in the example of a tall bridge down on the coast where we've got concerns about sea turtles. That light impact could extend much further. So that's a big change to that documentation. You're going to hear more about the development of the Ecology Stormwater Report, and the Ecology Stormwater Report wasn't created just for the JCP. In fact, it was already kind of underway at the same time, because we had issues with not being able to make commitments to our agencies about what kind of water treatment we were going to be able to have on our projects. And a lot of these species have water quality concerns. So that's going to be a big portion of the JCP moving forward, as you'll see. And you're going to hear a lot more about that from the other presenters. And then lastly, because we've had a lot of changes in the JCP, we have a new programmatic categorical exclusion agreement, or PCE. So changes have been made to that, and we've really tried to streamline that process even more than it already was. So how do we make these effect determinations? We've already gone out in the field, we've assessed habitat, but it's really important to know that there are some major changes to how we assess the impacts to our federal species. Now, the first is that if there is ever an IPAC consultation key, and there currently is only one that I'm aware of, that for the northern long-eared bat, that we will be using that. But if that's not available, we will be using edges, which is something that was developed by the Army Corps of Engineers as well. is the Fish and Wildlife Service. And the big thing about that's been around for a while. We have not adopted it, but the reason why is because we wanted to have a consistent process across all of our program. Through the JCP, the Federal Highway Administration was willing to adopt EDGES because EDGES is ultimately going to become those IPAC consultation keys. And so it'll take a time to get those EDGES into IPAC, but until then, they're going to serve as the go-to for how we assess federal species. That being said, they're not available for every single species yet. So when they're available, that's something you want to use. There is a table that you fill out associated with those EDGES, and it's just one table for all the different species. And you put that in after you've run through your EDGES, and you reference EDGES in your documentation, and then you're done. And oftentimes that's going to get you to a no effect, or it'll get you to a may affect, not likely to adversely affect. Sometimes it'll get you to formal consultation, and sometimes it'll say, we can't tell if it's formal or informal, request technical assistance. So let's talk about programmatic determinations, because everybody always loves when things fit under the programmatic no effect that we've previously had in our JCP. The nice thing about the programmatic determinations SOP in this JCP, and that's a lot of acronyms, apologies, is that it significantly reduces the documentation that we have to do on a project. That means faster schedules, faster delivery. But we are going to define all of those programmatic no effect project activities by zones. And you'll have to open up the JCP to see those zones. But it basically is talking about the roadway, the road side, the road slope, down into the maintained right-of-way. And so it tells you exactly what activities are allowed within each of those zones. But there are exceptions for every one of those zones. Sometimes we have species that come right up to the roadway edge, and even a project that may have, say, shoulder paving or shoulder building could have a major impact to a particular species. And so we have those exceptions there. But that doesn't mean you can't do those projects. It just means that we may need to do a different process. And we have developed a programmatic may affect agreement for a lot of our roadway maintenance projects. And it gives us the ability to do those for other species as well. And that gets us to a programmatic may affect, but not likely to adversely affect determination. As I mentioned, we have the opportunity to develop more of these programmatic assessments, AOEs, at any time. Of course, they take time, and so we can't just do them for everything right away, but we have plans to do ones for bridge maintenance activities. And we will continue to expand that, hopefully with an aquatic programmatic to follow. And it gives us the opportunity not only to do informal Section 7, but also potentially do formal Section 7 programmatically, which would be a huge time savings on projects and no longer be a project killer if you've got formal Section 7. So let's talk about the no effect in informal Section 7. The first big change is that we will be creating a project file in IPAC, and that starts with early coordination, but you'll see that it also goes into what we upload our documentation into. And so we have, with our no effect determinations, no agency response is required. And so the big thing there is it used to take 3 weeks for Federal Highway Administration to say, hey, yeah, we agree that this is no effect. They have delegated the ability to make no effect calls to us, which is now consistent with what the Corps has delegated to us as well. So GDOT can now make all no effect determinations. That typically means that we don't have habitat on a project, therefore cannot have any impact to the species. Now with may affect not likely to adversely affect, that's our informal Section 7, typically when we have habitat, but we don't believe that we're going to have an impact to the species or we haven't identified the species on site. Now, previously we had a 3-week review for our lead federal agency for that. And then we had a 4-week review period for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We can now, we can go directly to Fish and Wildlife Service instead of having to go through our lead federal agency for both federal and state funded projects. And we have a 21 calendar day agency review period, so 3 weeks down from 7 weeks. So another huge savings. Now, formal section 7, what have we done there? Well, again, we're going to be creating that project file in IPAC, and that again is very, very critical. We'll make our effect determination of may affect, likely to adversely affect, and we were going to send that to Federal Highway, and they will provide any comments or initiate formal section 7 within 21 calendar days. Fish and Wildlife Service within 21 calendar days will also tell us if they have a complete package. And that's really critical because we don't want to get well into this lengthy process and have them say, no, this isn't good, additional comments. So we get that confirmation early on in that review period that they think that the application is complete or the submittal is complete. And then they're going to provide that biological opinion within 90 days. And 90 days seems like a lot, but when you consider that it used to be 135 days, that's a pretty significant time savings. That's a month and a half that you're saving on your project schedules. So another thing that I was always very envious of GDOT's Cultural Resources is they had an agreement in place for reevaluating projects, and a lot of their reevaluations were very simple. They reviewed the process, determined that it was not going to have any change to or major change to what they previously assessed, and they were able just to document that and move on. We really tried to do something similar to that with the JCP. And so because we're using these IPAC determination keys, we're able to go through IPAC and we're able to look in a really cool feature of IPAC. When you create that project file, is that it will tell you if your species list is still current or not. And you can see there in the screenshot at the bottom, it says the species lists are no longer valid, meaning there's been a change to that species list. So that's really important to know. Even if you're waiting on plans, anything like that, you can know, okay, I'm going to have to go out and reassess for a different species potentially, or maybe a species has been dropped and you can drop that species from your report or your documentation moving forward. But you can go ahead and do that work and know what you may have to assess, because there may be field work that's required associated with that if you do have a new species added. If you do all that, you update the consultation key in IPAC, no agency review is necessary in most cases, but sometimes it will be. And in those cases, even for formal section 7, the agencies will have a review period of 21 calendar days, 3 weeks to reevaluate formal section 7, as well as any other types. But if we don't have an IPAC determination key available, then we may not need to reevaluate, but we want to be using edges. So if we meet all of these requirements that you see here, then we can move forward, and we can do that without moving forward with our agencies with no review period. And otherwise, we would just request some guidance if we don't meet all of those conditions from our lead federal agency and Fish and Wildlife Service about how to proceed. And then we'll update the project file and we'll move on. But again, that's going to be a really, really abbreviated period based on what we've previously been doing, either of no agency review required or 3 weeks. So we've talked a lot about Section 7, but there's also the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act. And that's something that gives the agencies the ability to comment on any wildlife on a project if we have certain types of impacts. So it's important to know which types of projects that these are going to apply to. You are not required to do FWCA coordination if the impacts to resources are not considered a water of the U.S. And if it is considered a water of the U.S., any ephemerals, open waters, and wetlands, except when it's bisecting a high-quality wetland as defined by the Corps of Engineers Wetland Mitigation SOP, those impacts to those other types of resources do not require FWCA as well. And so that's a change, because previously intermittent streams did require FWCA, they now no longer do. And if you have less than 100 linear feet of impact or 1.1 acre of impact to wetlands or open waters, then you don't have to do FWCA either. But when you do have perennial streams, impacts to those greater than 100 linear feet, when you have more than 0.1 acre of impact to a high quality wetland that you're bisecting, then we have a couple of different options. We've got programmatic coordination, and programmatic coordination is brand new. We've never had programmatic FWCA coordination before. And it gives two different criteria, and if we meet either one, then we're able to move forward programmatically with FWCA. The first is connectivity criteria, and this goes back to what we were mentioning before with as we looked at that culvert and we saw that it was very perched. If we have a bridge and there's no access underneath for terrestrial wildlife, if we are able to fix that, if the entirety of the structure accommodates both aquatic and terrestrial wildlife passage, then that means that we can move through FWCA programmatically. We don't have to wait on agency comments, and we don't get those project-specific comments, which is a real advantage, a lot of predictability for GDOT. The other criteria is a water quality criteria, and this is where we start to tie into the Ecology post-construction stormwater report, in that if we are able to treat stormwater runoff resulting in at least 60% TSS removal on a particular project, just where it relates to that particular resource that's being impacted, then that's something that we can move forward programmatically as well. But if we can't do either of those things, then we have project-specific coordination as well. And that would be concurrent reviews by Federal Highway and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and that brings it from previously a 7-week review period down to a 3-week review period. So big time savings there, but it doesn't mean that they won't ask for that water quality. Doesn't mean they won't ask for that connectivity criteria. It just means that they could ask for even more, and we're not sure exactly what they may ask for on a project-specific basis. So really important to think and really strongly consider those programmatic criteria. So let's talk about the takeaways from today. And let's start with the Endangered Species Act. It really standardizes the way that we make effect determinations. And so that should really help folks as they're going through and evaluating the impact of species, and help you write your documentation so that you can make sure that you are giving the agencies exactly what they need, because those edges will walk you through exactly what the habitat criteria is, and you'll be able to put that directly into your documentation. But it also really expands the programmatic determination activities that means no agency review period. And so that's going to be really critical, not having that agency review period. And the programmatic determinations is something that can grow and grow and grow. And so you think about the life of the JCP in this new format, gives us the ability to really potentially do programmatic determinations for all of our species and all of our project actions. So that in the future, we may know exactly what we need to do on each project moving forward and have a programmatic process to do so. Again, for no effect determinations, no agency review period, meaning we complete our documentation and we move forward. And then for informal section 7, that's project specific, we will move forward by initiating directly with Fish and Wildlife Service. Federal Highway will do concurrent reviews, and down to 21 days from 7 weeks. And then we have really clear guidance for both early coordination and for reinitiating Section 7 consultation. So those are really important things that we've added with this JCP. The Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, that's something that we've provided very clear guidance about what resources and what impacts are going to require FWCA coordination. That was previously not quite as clear, and you probably could get a different answer any 2 ecologists that you ask. But we also will have a reduced project-specific agency review period with that. But more importantly, and this is really something I can't stress enough, we have that programmatic coordination option with no agency review period. And they may ask the exact same thing through project-specific coordination, and then you've just added time onto your project schedule. So it's something you really want to consider on each of your projects as you're trying to keep those project schedules on time. But in general, we've got more clarity and predictability in our process. not just for the ecologists, but for project managers, for designers, to know what the expectations of our agencies are. We have those reduced agency review timelines, which is going to have a lot of opportunities to recover project schedules because of. If you make certain commitments to our agencies, then we're going to be able to move through the evaluation process and our coordination process with our agencies a lot faster. And then overall, we have improved environmental outcomes as well. And so it's a real great win-win when we can really advance projects, open up potentially some things during construction, and also have that greater impact to, or less impact to ecological resources. I think it's really important to understand where you fit within an organization's statements. And so this is our GDOT's organizational statements, and starting with a vision, leadership and transportation. We believe that we're doing that. There are a few other states out there that are doing programmatic consultations, but GDOT is among some of the first to really be taking advantage of some of these things. And if you look at our mission statement, it talks about that innovation. It also talks about safety. And as we think about trying to move wildlife underneath our roadways instead of over them, that's a lot of a safety aspect as well that we're improving with this JCP. It has those improved environmental outcomes. We can make more sustainable roads, and it's mobility not only for the traveling public, but for the wildlife that is on either side of them as well. We're really working on streamlining those processes in our ecology coordination with our agencies, and we're using innovation to really deliver our mission responsibly and more efficiently. And we're putting Georgian safety first by trying to move wildlife again under our roadways instead of over the top of them. And with that, I think that is my time, and I will stop if there are any questions.
Hey, Chris, this is Dave. We got a couple questions in the chat. The first one, can you explain what scenarios we should use the PAW worksheet for?
For the PAW worksheet, the programmatic assessment worksheet, anything that applies for the programmatic determinations will likely be able to use that PAW worksheet. So especially what we've typically been using that for is when we have a roadway maintenance project, or we have a quick response project that may be adding a turn lane or something like that. Things that are going to have very, very minimal impact. And so when you go to the programmatic determinations SOP, it will list a number of different project activities. And as long as all your project activities on the project fall into one of those project activities and you don't have any species exceptions on your projects, then you can use that programmatic no effect determination and you can use that PAW worksheet.
Thank you, Chris. We've also received a note about Fish and Wildlife versus NIMS jurisdiction over sea turtles. I won't go too deeply into that, but folks should be aware that there are two departments of the federal government that are concerned with sea turtles, both the Department of the Interior and the Department of Commerce. Department of Commerce is NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, whereas the Department of the Interior has Fish and Wildlife Service jurisdiction, both under the Endangered Species Act. So that's an interesting note, someone that's left here for us. And then I'll move on to another question for you, Chris. Under the new FWCA, if a wetland that is not being bisected has more than 0.1 acre of impact, does it qualify for FWCA coordination? The new AOE template has them listed separately as newly bisected wetland and greater than 0.1 acre of impact, which makes it seem like there are separate criteria.
Gotcha. Yeah, so there's two main criteria when you're talking about wetlands in FWCA. And the first is that it's got to be high quality. So that's your first test. Do I have a high quality wetland on my project? And you're going to evaluate that based on running through the first part of that, the qualitative part of the wetland mitigation SOP table. Okay, now you've decided you have a high quality wetland on your project. The next thing to determine is whether or not your project bisects that. And bisects that means that you split it in half. If you simply have it runs up to your roadway, let's say, and you're going to widen that roadway and you're just going to take a little bit more off of the edge of that high quality wetland, that does not require FWCA coordination. But if you are building, say, a new location roadway and it goes through the middle of a high quality wetland, that's something that our agencies want to have some comments on. And you still have that opportunity for the programmatic FWCA coordination by meeting one of those two criteria. But otherwise, they would be giving you project-specific requirements. And so, yeah, that's the only time that you would be assessing high-quality wetlands or wetlands in general. And I'm sorry, it has to also, you have to impact at least 0.1 acre, which if you have a new location roadway is likely the case.
Thank you, Chris. And one last question here. For FWCA programmatic coordination, do both connectivity and water quality criteria need to be met, or just one?
Just one. You can, and that's not to say that you shouldn't try to achieve both. If we have the ability to achieve both and the project team is supportive of that, then that is great. That's a great environmental outcome. But if something dictates that we cannot do both, or it's just fiscally not responsible to do both, you only have to do one to meet that programmatic determination criteria and have no agency review.
All right, well, thank you, Chris. If there are more questions on this from the audience, please post them. And Chris, I guess without further ado, I'll take the stage from you.
Sounds good. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. All right. I wanted to share with everybody that the Ecology post-construction stormwater report has grown to be a very helpful piece of our puzzle here as we try and align everything Chris just spoke about with the engineers who are working on these projects as well. And so while we've been over a lot of ecology-centric efforts, I do want to let folks know that we are shifting to more design-centric efforts moving forward. We do have a lot to present on for designers. If you'll bear with me, I have the last ecology piece of this, and I would encourage ecologists and other practitioners listening in, please stick around and hear what the designers have on their plates as a result of this undertaking as well. It's best when we all understand what all the parties on our teams are doing. So, if y'all attended the last ACEC summer series, this piece of wallpaper might look familiar to you. To try and remind everybody that Earth is chock full of water, humans are chock full of water, and all of the life on Earth depends on water, just like we do. And so, as I said in a previous ACEC summer series presentation, if you don't think water is important, think again, think different. It's very important. It's critically important for our ecosystem as well, our own health. I will also add that this undertaking dovetails well with what engineers are already thinking about when it comes to water. Obviously, water on roadways can be a safety issue. And also a sustainability issue in terms of making sure that water doesn't create, erosion problems, et cetera. And so while weighing and balancing the many considerations of roadway design and its effects on ecological resources, we do need a team of allies to put together the best plan for how we're going to deal with our roadway infrastructure and our water. So many thanks to the good folks at Office of Design Policy and Support for bringing this innovative idea forward a few years back under Brent Story. We engaged about the ENV BMP inbox, which we'll talk more about here. And it does create some very helpful touch points for ecologists and roadway engineers. So many thanks to Sarah Jones and Brad McManus, who you'll hear from shortly, and also to Ann Sexton-Paperno, who did a good deal of the heavy lift on behalf of Ecology for this effort. Next slide, please. All right, so what is the the EPCSR, and how does it benefit the department? This is a new report template created by the Ecology section and ODPS, and we are trying to adapt an existing format of a post-construction stormwater report to also address ecology resources. This is extremely helpful from the perspective of we already had a wheel, we didn't have to create one. So simply modifying the existing post-construction stormwater report to address ecology resources has been very, it's facilitated the development of this report and the template and the help file that we're going to today. Ecology resources that are relevant to this undertaking, and Chris has just spoken about this. We really are focused on perennial streams and high quality wetlands that may be bisected under the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act. We will address considerations related to those resources, and then also protected species habitat, so aquatic habitats that are suitable or occupied by protected species within the state of Georgia. When we coordinate with our agency partners, they may request that GDOT conduct some water quality management at a given location. If it's protected species, it's often coming back to us on early coordination, but we can receive input from our HUC 10 lists, IPAC, the NARGIS letter, various other touch points of technical assistance, programmatic AOEs, and also programmatic FWCA through the JCP. And so there are various inputs for how we might approach each of these scenarios. I will say the upshot still comes down to, if we build it, will it be useful? Will it have the intended effect on water quality? And that's part of the value that this report will add to our work. So once we come up with this, the assessment of these things, we can actually address both Section 7 and FWCA as ecologists based on the feedback that we get from engineers. So some of the benefits of the EPCSR include the fact that we're now on step as two offices at least, the environmental office as well as the engineers who are dealing with stormwater and trying to consider that. It also improves the Section 7 and FWCA coordination efficiency while bringing water quality concerns to the surface, so to speak, in the design process. With a set procedure and timeline, this will give more confidence in our commitments to agencies, reduce the number of changes to BMPs after ecology AOE reports are transmitted, and organize communications with all stakeholders. It also creates consistency in documenting resources, treatment targets, and expectations of the requested analyses. Next slide, please. So for the ecologists, it's not too heavy a lift to start to populate this template. So the report begins with the ecologist kicking it off. And again, it should look familiar to folks who are familiar with MS4 feasibility reports and post-construction stormwater reports related to MS4 resources. I will be clear, this is separate from the MS4 analysis. This is a different set of laws and regulations that GDOT needs to navigate as well. And so although MS4 in the past has sort of been the only analysis related to water quality in many cases, I want to let you all know this is also a water quality analysis that's expected moving forward. So in this table, the ecologist lists resources for design to consider in their analysis in column 1, and the ecology concern for that resource is explained in column 2, which is to say, is it something that we're concerned about because it's a protected species, or is it a resource that we are addressing under the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act? Once we send it to design, you can see they have a lot of work to do relative to the ecologist in terms of populating the data here. Thank you in advance, designers, for undertaking this effort. I will say that design's going to determine if the water resource is impaired, the outfall label, the BMPs that were evaluated, they're going to put down what BMPs they considered. The practicability assessment criteria used to include and exclude BMPs, and which BMPs are ultimately selected, if any, as practicable. The table will also include the location on the plans and the maintenance information for the resource and associated BMPs. Next slide, please. You can see that what comes out of this really has to do with, for an ecologist, we're really trying to focus on what the upshot is here. So trusting the engineers to do their analysis, to follow the already pretty well understood, I think, feasibility considerations that, again, Sarah and Brad are about to talk more about. When the ecologist receives this information back, they'll have a determination earlier in the project than we currently get this typically. Up to now, that for practicability, either a given BMP will be determined to be practicable or not. That's important because it can go directly into our consultation with our agencies, and whether it's the Endangered Species Act or the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, GDOT will have not only a determination to share with the agencies, but also we can explain how we arrived at that determination. Next slide, please. So as y'all know, we have two different major project delivery mechanisms at GDOT, design build and design bid build. Design bid build is what we'll start with, DBB. This is the traditional delivery model that GDOT has employed, wherein design happens prior to let, construction happens after let, and ideally those two don't have much overlap, if any. We'll talk about design build in a moment, which operates under a different set of assumptions. But just to follow what we've got here, for design bid build, after Ecology goes out in the field and documents all the ecology resources, as you all know, the A3M is held. The A3M is the Avoidance and Minimization Measures meeting. During that meeting, the ecologist is able to present which resources are within the project area, and also we can determine coming out of the A3M which we might anticipate being impacted. After A3M, there are some projects with tons of resources found during the survey, say over 100 resources, but ultimately that's our survey boundary, and we do want to focus in on the, say, 30% of those that may actually incur impacts, rather than tasking engineers with every water that came within 100 feet of a given project area, or whatever your ESB boundary is. So we are trying to focus on the waters that matter, so to speak, that we can have some benefit to if we're impacting them. And then instead of having design, spending their time on those other resources, we are trying to spend that time more judiciously. In this report, the attachment A table can be filled out during the A3M meeting, possibly. So for folks looking for efficiency, consider bringing that to your A3M meeting and going through that directly. Once Ecology sends the attachment A table to design, Ecology should expect the completed EPCSR 18 weeks prior to PFPR, which is in time to incorporate the results into the Ecology AOE. As you all know, timing is everything at GDOT, and we have worked with engineers and environmentalists to try and identify what the necessary timeframes are here. So that's what we're laying out. If the report completion were lined up with a PDP milestone, it would most likely be around concept approval. And so because we identify resources prior to concept approval, ideally, that's when we have our greatest opportunity to consider avoidance and minimization. And also, if post-construction BMPs may be warranted, that's the best time to start considering them because we haven't made decisions yet about right-of-way and so on. The hope is that no changes will be needed to the report once completed, but design policy will use PFPR, FFPR, and final plan submittals as touch points to make sure there are no changes needed to the BMPs related to ecology resources throughout the project. Ecology is also able to flag any changes noticed at any time, and any changes will be captured within the EPCSR addendum. Next slide, please. Design build, a different project delivery approach that follows a very different set of theories. And as y'all are aware, we have a pre-let side of the design build and then a post-let where some design will continue. So this slide is going to focus on the pre-let side of this design build approach. It's very similar to design bid build projects. In fact, nothing, we're still focused on the A3M. We're still focused on, that ENVBMP inbox submittal. And in this case, the pre-let GEC would submit the draft EPCSR to the ENVBMP inbox. At the end of the A3M, that's when the ecologist will submit attachment A with target ecology resources and their concerns to design, and technical studies is kicked off with the 30% costing plans, and the ecology AOE reports are refined with 60% costing plans. So the EPCSR will run parallel with the ecology AOE development, and the completed report should be expected with the 60% costing plans for design build projects. Let's go ahead and see what happens post-let. Next slide, please. So post-let for design build, as you all know, this handoff, the design continues after let, which means that the design builder will have an opportunity taking over at NTP2 to incorporate any necessary updates to the existing EPCSR based on lockdown plans. The updated EPCSR will be part of the ecology addendum and the NEPA reeval prior to NTP3 being issued. So there is a way that this works well in the design bid build world, and now we've also created a path for this within the design build world, which doesn't tie the hands of the design builder, which is part of the innovation that innovative delivery is looking for through the design build process. Next slide, please. So for whether it's design build or design bid build, the critical date to bear in mind, everyone, is July 15th, 2021. This was 6 days ago, or 5 days ago, can't do math. That is when the EPCSR, I think, went officially into use, July 15th, per an email from Chris Rudd on July 14th. What I want y'all to know is that if your concept has already been approved, this EPCSR is available for technical assistance, so to speak, or guidance or support of your efforts, but this is not a requirement for projects that had their concepts approved prior to July 15th, 2021. Subsequent concept approvals, this is going to be part of the project, this is supposed to be part of the project schedule as it rolls forward. So starting from now, please be aware if you're working on brand new projects, this is intended to be a required part of the plan development process and the coordination between the Office of Environmental Services and the Office of Design Policy and Support, or whoever your roadway designer happens to be. With that, I will turn it over to some engineers who can describe better for engineers how this will work on their end. Sarah will speak, but first I believe we're going to hear from Brad McManus. So thank you for your time and patience, everyone. Over to you, Brad.
Thank you, Dave, and welcome everybody. Appreciate everybody joining us. That was a pretty good overview. I think you'll see some of that information again in a minute. So if you didn't pull it all in, I guess you'll have the opportunity to see it again. As I was just introduced, I guess I'll go ahead and introduce myself again. I'm Brad McManus, and I'm with the Office of Design Policy and Support, and I lead the Water Resources Group. So the purpose of this presentation is to introduce the Ecology post-construction stormwater preparation and submittal process to designers and ecologists. Let me catch up to the slides here. Yeah, here's an overview of what we'll be talking about today as it pertains to the Ecology post-construction stormwater template. Each of the squares is a topic that we're going to cover. And as we go through the presentation of the topic, will appear in the top right corner of each slide to help you keep track of where we are in the presentation. First, we'll go over the Ecology post-construction stormwater template, and then we'll go over choosing which post-construction stormwater template to use, and next we'll go over the applicability and rollout, and then the submittal schedule. The general stormwater concepts, the differences from MS4, and then how to prepare an Ecology post-construction stormwater report, and how to prepare the plans. A special provision 169 that goes along with it tells you all about how to construct these things. Contacts and other training that's available. At the end of the presentation, we'll go over we'll have some time to go over some questions. So next slide, please. And as Dave mentioned, here are some benefits of the Ecology post-construction stormwater template. So what is the purpose of the post-construction BMPs? Post-construction BMPs are purposed for a variety of reasons. Sometimes there's a single BMP that has multiple purposes, and these purposes include both compliance with MS4 permit, they include detention, or ecology purposes, maybe I should say ecological purposes, such as mitigating impacts to protected species or removing seasonal restrictions. Next slide, please. Here's some definitions and acronyms which will be useful to know as we go through the presentation. First, post-construction stormwater report stands, well, anyway, I read it for you. A post-construction stormwater report is a document containing the analysis of runoff. There are a few different types of post-construction stormwater reports. However, all of them contain analysis of runoff. The differences between the reports is that they are prepared for different purposes, and therefore they have different contents. The type of post-construction stormwater report you may be most familiar with is the MS4 post-construction stormwater report. And that report is prepared to comply with GDOT's municipal separate stormwater sewer system permit. It is prepared only inside GDOT's, that's MS4, only prepared inside GDOT's MS4 areas. The PLE is an acronym which stands for project level exclusion. And that means that the whole project doesn't need to be part of the MS4 post-construction stormwater report, doesn't need a full post-construction stormwater report, even though the project is in an MS4 area, one of those. The next type of report, is the Ecology post-construction stormwater report. And this type of report we're mainly be focusing on today. The Ecology post-construction stormwater report is prepared when agency coordination with the ecologist indicates that water quality treatment needs to be assessed on a project. The last type of report is a non-MS4 detention report. It is prepared on projects that are outside of GDOT's MS4 permit and is prepared to comply with GDOT's drainage manual, section 10.2.3, which contains the detention policy. Detention is holding water, just define detention, is just holding water in a BMP and releasing it slowly to prevent flooding or erosion. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is what you're looking at here is a flow chart, which can be used to decide which template to use. Since sometimes a project will have multiple purposes for analyzing runoff. So you'd start at the top of the flow chart. If the project is in an MS4 area, follow the green arrow down. If the project does not qualify for project level exclusion, use the MS4 post-construction stormwater report template. This template can also contain detention and ecology analysis if needed. If the project is in an MS4 area but does qualify for a project level exclusion, prepare the project level exclusion documentation and check if drainage manual 10.2.3, that's the detention section, indicates that the detention report is needed for the project. Regardless of whether detention analysis is needed for the project, proceed to the multicolored diamond. Does coordination with ecologist and agency indicate that water quality analysis is needed for ecological purposes? If section 10.2.3 indicates the detention analysis is needed, but water quality analysis not needed for ecological purposes, use a non-MS4 detention report template. If both detention analysis is needed and water quality analysis is needed for ecological purposes, combine the Ecology post-construction stormwater report and the non-MS4 detention report into a report containing all the information for both templates. If detention analysis is not needed, but water quality analysis is needed for ecological purposes, use the Ecology post-construction stormwater report template. If detention analysis is not needed and no water quality analysis is needed for ecological purposes, then no stormwater report is needed for the project. Next slide, thank you. Yeah, these are our Venn diagrams, I believe. The information on this slide is the same information as the last slide, just presented in a little bit different way. You just got the circles there. Everything can be included in MS4 post-construction stormwater report there if it falls in an MS4 area. And then you've got the part outside of MS4 to do outside of MS4 areas. Then you can, and you still need detention, then you could do the non-MS4 detention report. Or if it's outside MS4 areas and you only need to do water quality analysis, then you have use the ecological or the Ecology post-construction stormwater report. Or if it's still outside of the MS4 area and you need both, then you got them both combined there at the last on the far right. All right, next slide, please. Yeah, as Dave mentioned, here's a rollout schedule for the template. And he was just talking about that a minute ago. We have the inter-office memo that was published containing this information. And you can see there it says if you had your concept approved by set by July 15th, just this past July 15th, then it's used. It's not a requirement to use it, but it is there for guidance. If it has been approved, that's what I was just saying. If it has been approved, you need to use it as guidance. If it has not been approved, then it is the requirement. All right, next slide, please. To find notification memo, go to this is telling you where to find it. You go to Roads, Design Manuals and Guide, Design Manuals, Policy Announcement. Excuse me. You go to the Roads, Design Manuals, Policy Announcements. To find the Ecology post-construction stormwater template, the help file, go to the Roads, Design Guides, Roadway, and there you see the section there, Roadway, and then go to, in the category, go to Design and Environmental Coordination Guidance. And next slide, please. Thank you. And as Dave mentioned, we went over this. Dave went over this a minute ago. This is just that traditional delivery. The when you start it, it started right there at the end of A3M, and you see the tasks that are done there. The ecologist completes the technical assistance and determines treatment targets with the agencies, and then the ecologist and ODPS coordinate with district construction and maintenance for the input, and the ecologist then fills out the first two columns. And then of course we have our section. We get more involved here is when we get into the technical studies, and this is before the PFPR, and when they submit, the designer submits the draft Ecology post-construction stormwater template to the environmental BMP email address right there. And then of course we're going to look it over. And then there'll be some back and forth between us and the designer. And then we should have this thing approved 18 weeks before the PFPR. And of course, then there's our review of the plans, in which case we may or may not have to review we might have to revise, excuse me, the report. So let's go to the next slide, thank you. And then here's the innovative delivery schedule that Dave mentioned again. And it's a similar process at the very beginning, but then we have the GEC getting in with the technical studies and submitting the draft report to the environmental BMP email address. And of course, we'll review it again. And then we have this difference with the 60% costing plans, where we look it over and revise the plans related to the BMP. Well, we look at it, review the plan, excuse me, related to the BMP. I'm sorry, we're not revising it. That's coming from the GEC. And then we'll include that in the include the report in Ecology for the AOER. All right, next slide, please. This is for the post-let section, and this one we went over too, so it's just a rehash of post-let section that Dave went over. And whereas the post-let developer is going to review and then revise the report if he needs to, and then he may need to make updates. At least need to make an update to make it his own, and then it will be submitted again to the environmental. As a draft would then be submitted again to the environmental BMP email, and then we'll review it again, and then and then if all the comments are addressed, we may accept it, or we may turn it back in and keep going with the review process. But in the end, it's going to be finalized and locked down plans, and then it's going to the GDOT environmental for reevaluation, and then it's proceeding to the notice to proceed. All right, next slide, please. All right, this is some of the definitions. So we'll go through some of these general stormwater concepts. Post-construction stormwater BMP, best management practice, is really where that comes from. It's a permanent BMP. It's usually a structure of some sort, such as a bioretention area. But in this presentation, we'll use BMP only to refer to post-construction BMPs, and those are going to be, like I just mentioned, the bioretention. Here we got some examples of filter strips, grass channels, and wet detention basins. Those are also BMPs. The Ecology post-construction stormwater template is for permanent BMP analysis rather than for erosion control analysis. So we also call erosion control BMPs. Those are not post-construction. Those are actually during construction. So that's why we have the post-construction language in there. Sediment basins also are not permanent BMPs. Next slide, please. Here are BMPs that GDOT normally builds. The drainage manual has a BMP menu table, post-construction menu table, by the way, which you can use to find out which BMPs can be sized for each sizing criteria. We will define the sizing criteria over the next few slides. Next slide, please. Thank you. The water quality volume is the volume resulting from the 1.2 inches of rainfall. It's usually based on the net new impervious area. Different BMPs provide different treatment percentages for water quality volume. There are several processes which BMPs use to treat the water quality volume. They include filtration, settling, and infiltration. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, and here you have an example of a bioslope, which can be sized to treat the water quality volume. It primarily uses filtration and infiltration to treat the water quality. You can see the, never mind. Yes, thank you. Yeah, you can see that the media there provides the filtration part of it, and then you have the under drain, which will take the filtered water out and discharge it further down the slope. Next slide, please. The runoff reduction volume is the volume resulting from 1 inch of rainfall. It is usually based on net new impervious area. There are several BMPs which can infiltrate the runoff reduction. Different BMPs provide different infiltration percentages for the runoff reduction volume. Hold on a second before we move to the next slide. Runoff reduction, I think the idea here is, and I may be skipping ahead of myself, but I think the idea here is that runoff reduction, if you can infiltrate 100% of the runoff reduction, then that is basically 80% of the 1.2. Basically, you meet the one of the MS4 requirements of treating 80% of the 1.2, and I actually think it's better because it also addresses extra water or increased water. Next slide. And here, as I was just talking about, for example, the bioretention basin with a capped underdrain can provide 100% of the runoff reduction volume. Next slide, please. The channel protection volume is the volume resulting from the 1 year 24-hour storm. There are some BMPs which can provide the extended detention of the channel protection volume. The Q25, or otherwise known as the overbank flood protection, it's the peak 25. It's the 25-year peak flow, as we say. In other words, on average, this flow would happen once every 25 years. Of course, that gets some people to think it could happen. It only happens once every 25 years. That's not really the case. It's just on average. That's the way it has worked out. You could have several 25-year events, one after another. But there are some BMPs which can detain the increases to the 25-year peak flow. And then the Q100 is the 100-year peak flow or extreme flood protection. There's some BMPs which can detain increases to the 100-year peak flow, similar to the 25 year as far as thinking about it. All right, next slide, please. This slide shows how the sizing criteria works. You're going to nest each volume inside of another. So we talked about the 100-year and the 25-year peak flows and the 1 year and 24-hour peak flow, and then also the water quality volume. As you can see here, a single BMP can infiltrate the runoff reduction, can either infiltrate the runoff reduction volume or it can treat the water quality volume. If it's not possible to treat both, if it's not possible to both infiltrate the runoff reduction volume and treat the water quality volume, maybe I read that wrong, excuse me. A single BMP can either infiltrate the runoff reduction volume or it can treat the water quality volume. It is not possible for both to both infiltrate the runoff reduction volume and treat the water quality volume. That's what I was talking about earlier. If you infiltrate the runoff reduction volume, you really don't need to do treat the water quality volume. And therefore, if a BMP is sized to infiltrate the runoff reduction volume, it does not need to also be sized for the water quality volume. And depending on the BMP, the channel protection volume can be detained and the runoff reduction volume can be infiltrated in the same BMP. In this case, the volumes will be nested rather than added together. And depending on the BMP, the channel protection volume, the peak 25 year or the overbank protection volume, and the Q100 can be detained in a water quality volume. It can all be treated in the same BMP. In this case, the volumes will be nested rather than added together. So each volume, so if you have one volume, your other volume is just going to be inside of that, plus a little bit more for the extra volume. I don't know if you understand exactly, but you can see the diagram there where the dots go all the way through for the Q25, and then also you can see how it all extends below it, and then how the channel protection volume has the hashes that go all the way down into the water quality volume. So you're nesting them. All right, next slide, please. Thank you. So what are the warranting criteria? The warranting criteria are scenarios from section 10.2.3, excuse me, of the drainage manual. If one of the warranty criteria is met, then proposing detention is likely justifiable. And what are the feasibilities and outfall exclusions? Feasibility is the ability to implement a BMP which is effective, appropriate, and constructible for MS4 purposes. An outfall level exclusion is a situation when a BMP is not needed at the outfall for MS4 purposes. And then suitability, we have these different terms. Suitability is the ability to implement a BMP which is effective, appropriate, and constructible for section 2.10.2.3 detention purposes. And move on to the to the area that we're going to talk about most here, is the practicability. So we're going to look at the differences between the stormwater analysis for ecological purposes versus MS4 purposes. See the Ecology post-construction stormwater template for practicability criteria. What is practicability? It is the ability to implement a BMP which is effective, appropriate, and constructible for ecological purposes. Now, practicability analysis is in the Ecology post-construction stormwater report is similar to outfall level exclusion and feasibility analysis for MS4. However, there are some differences in the criteria. Additionally, practicability criteria include room for adjustment based on project-specific or species-specific needs, while MS4 criteria do not have this flexibility. Here's a list of Ecology post-construction stormwater report criteria when building a BMP that might not be practicable. See the Ecology post-construction stormwater template for exact wording, and that's found there on the roads website that we talked about earlier. Also note that there is a star beside each criteria which can be overridden via project-specific agreement. The practicability criteria are: if the BMP would cause an alignment change, safety concern, with a safety concern, if the BMP would be in line with the stream or place in the fill in a stream, if the BMP would be the only impact to a wetland, if it's in sheet flow, if the flows are outside of the project right away or from undisturbed areas, if the BMP would cause a loss of habitat or adversely affect protected species. Another reason you might not want that it would not have practicability is if the BMP would cause significant damage to a cultural or community resource, if the BMP would be the only cause of displacements of a residence or business, if there are site limitations such as bedrock, contaminated soils, or utilities, if infiltration capacity is insignificant, or if there's a lack of gravity flow to the BMP. Now let's look at what MS4 outfall level exclusions and infeasibility criteria are not practicability criteria. So it's the difference between MS4 and Ecology post-construction stormwater. So one, cost and feasibility. Another is the minimal net new impervious area. Another is 90-day delay or greater, 90-day or greater delay, and the site being too small to infiltrate a significant volume are MS4 criteria, and they're not practicability criteria. However, the Ecology post-construction stormwater report analysis does not apply to drainage areas minimal net new impervious area, even though it is not specifically a practicability criteria. All right, why look at practicability? Although BMPs can benefit aquatic environment, it's still important to check if BMPs would have any unintended negative impacts, and to check that the BMP will function as intended. One major difference between the Ecology post-construction stormwater report and the MS4 post-construction stormwater report is that for the Ecology post-construction stormwater report, partial credit needs to be considered. This means that if a BMP doesn't provide the full target treatment percentage, the treatment or infiltration benefit, it does not provide This means that if the BMP doesn't provide the full targeted treatment percentage, in other words, the treatment or infiltration benefit, it does provide if it does, it still needs to be recorded. Not sure if I said that correctly. If it doesn't meet the full target, in other words, all its treatments, then it still needs to be recorded what it's doing. Also, if an incidental BMP such as filter strips, grass channels, or OGFC is not large enough to meet the full sizing criteria, the designer would still take credit for the water that the BMP does treat, infiltrate, or detain. For ecology post-construction stormwater reports, it is important, especially important, to demonstrate a good faith effort to meet treatment targets to the extent practicable. The tone of the ecology post-construction stormwater report should always be positive. And be sure not to use practicability criteria to exclude a BMP unless the BMP is genuinely not practicable. All right, this graphic here approximates the level of effort for the different stormwater reports. The MS4 post-construction stormwater report has the least range and effort because it actually has the least range, but has the most overall effort. The non-MS4 detention reports have the most range and effort because they could take a lot to do, or they may take very little to do, depending if you're actually doing detention or not. That's because the report is much larger if ponds are proposed versus if ponds are not proposed. So that was doing the detention. The ecology post-construction stormwater report is anticipated to have a moderate range and effort and a moderate effort overall. All right, now we're going to turn the presentation over to Sarah Jones.
Hello, I'm Sarah Jones. I'm also from the Office of Design Policy and Support. I work for Bride McManus. So now let's talk about how to prepare an ecology post-construction stormwater report. Here's the summary of the EPCSR contents. It has a cover page, a summary table, BMP evaluation, and several appendices. And we'll go over these in the coming slides. Here is the recommended order of steps for preparing an ecology post-construction stormwater report. And we're going to go through these steps one by one, but I wanted to put a summary of all the steps so you can go back and reference the slides when you begin your report. So the first step is by the designer or the ecologist. So after coordinating with appropriate agencies, which the ecologist does, district maintenance, district construction, then the first step is to add coordination documentation to Appendix F. Be sure the coordination and subsequent documentation includes the area of potential effect, the pollutants of concern, protected species if applicable, sizing criteria, percent removal targets for the water quality volume and/or the runoff reduction volume, and whether the treatment will be for the net new impervious area or the total impervious area. So once you have these notes, send them to the agency and receive written or email concurrence, or edit them until you get written or email concurrence on the agreed upon initial treatment parameters and include that correspondence in Appendix F. The second step, which is done by the ecologist, is to fill out Attachment A, Column 1, with the water resources which need analysis, and Column 2 showing the purpose of analysis. Step 3 is the designer will prepare Appendices A, B, and C. Appendix A contains drainage area maps. To prepare drainage area maps, load the relevant DGNs, locate the water resources from Attachment A, identify the outfalls which drain to those water resources, delineate the pre-development and post-development drainage areas, check how existing proposed pipes, culverts, grading, and ditches influence the delineations, then print PDF. For additional assistance preparing drainage area maps, you can take a look at the MS4 PCSR help file, and that'll give you specific DGN levels and display guidance. Appendix B is the soils map from the Web Soil Survey. Here is the process for creating a soils map for an Ecology post-construction stormwater report. And again, these slides will be posted online, so I'm going through them fairly quickly to save time today, but they will be posted so you can look at them in more detail later. So Appendix C will have stormwater runoff quality calculations. First, check the agreed upon treatment parameters to see if the treatment is for the net new impervious area or the total impervious area. Then for each drainage area delineated, calculate the size and volumes agreed upon, include the formulas, the value of each variable, and the resultant volumes in Appendix C. The fourth step is to account for incidental treatment. Look for BMPs which will already be on the project, such as OGFC, which is open graded friction course, it's a type of pavement, grass channels, or filter strips. Record incidental BMPs in attachments A and B. Calculate how much treatment is provided by these BMPs, even if the treatment is less than a goal. Add these calculations to Appendix E. If treatment parameters cannot be fully met with incidental BMPs, look for the best location where a non-incidental BMP could be proposed in each drainage area delineated, if necessary. Analyze these non-incidental BMPs for practicability. Start with BMPs that are most appropriate for the drainage area, that best address the treatment parameters, and that have the lowest maintenance ratings. Record analysis in Attachment B and add the results to Attachment A. Next, check Attachment B to be sure there's analysis for each drainage area, which goes to a water resource identified by the ecologist. You may have multiple outfalls per water resource. That's just a note. For each BMP which is practicable, add the size and calculations to Appendix E. For each drainage area that does not have practicable BMP, document the impracticability in Appendix D. Fill out Appendix G cost calculations for each practicable BMP, which is non-incidental. Incidental BMPs do not have a cost. So why do we do Appendix G if there's no cost feasibility? We still find it helpful to keep track of about how expensive these are going to be. And if there is a BMP that would have an exorbitant cost, then that might be reason to have conversation with the agencies. But there is no specific cutoff. It's just something we record. So step 7 is adding any structural BMPs to the plans. We'll go over later in the presentation how to add BMPs to the plans. The last step of the EPCSR preparation process is to submit the EPCSR with a link to the plans to the E&B BMP inbox. So, as previously mentioned, there might be a project or even part of a project which needs MS4 analysis, ecology stormwater analysis, and attention analysis. So what should you do if a project needs analysis for multiple purposes? If there is a purpose for analysis that applies to the outfall, which does not have an exclusion criteria, then you should build a BMP. This could include an incidental BMP. For guidance, you can use the Venn diagrams in this presentation. So this might get a bit complicated. So again, you might want to go through the slides yourself after this presentation if you're a practitioner to more absorb this information. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to any of us. So here's a table comparing the different exclusion criteria. So for full wording of infeasibilities, outfall level exclusions, and suitability criteria, see the drainage manual. See the EPCSR template for full wording of the practicability criteria. There are some practicability criteria that have a star. A star means that the practicability criteria may be overturned by a project-specific or species-specific agreement. And that would be recorded in the, I think it's Appendix F, which is the initial treatment targets. So suitability criteria and practicability criteria were derived from MS4 criteria, and all suitability criteria and all practicability criteria are also feasibility criteria or outfall level exclusions. However, some of the exact wording is different. So it's important to check the correct reference document when doing your analysis. So here's a general Venn diagram for how to determine if a BMP will be built if there are multiple purposes of analysis for a drainage area. The dark blue represents situations where a BMP is feasible and has no outfall level exclusion. The green area represents situations where a BMP is practicable. The light blue area represents situations where BMP is suitable. As always, keep in mind that project-specific agreements can overturn some of the practicability criteria. The yellow circle represents situations where a BMP should be built. But if a BMP is practicable but not suitable, contact ODPS and OES. So I'm going to spend several minutes on this slide so we can all absorb the information together. Let's go through these Venn diagrams in clockwise order. In the top left square on this slide, we have the same Venn diagram from the previous slide. So we have MS4, ecology, and detention all applying to the outfall. In the top right square, we have the same Venn diagram, but the drainage area is only being analyzed for ecology purposes and for MS4 purposes. So the light blue detention shape is not shown. In these scenarios, the practicability criteria are the most strict. So if the BMP falls within this yellow circle, then you would build a BMP. In the bottom right square, we have the same Venn diagram, but the drainage area is only being analyzed for ecology and detention purposes. So the dark blue MS4 shape is not shown. In this scenario, suitability criteria are the most strict unless there is a project-specific agreement that overturns a practicability criteria. In the bottom left square, we have the same Venn diagram, but the drainage area is only being analyzed for MS4 and detention purposes, so the green ecology shape is not shown. In this scenario, suitability criteria are the strictest. So when you have a project or you have an outfall, first figure out what the purposes of analysis are and use those purposes of analysis to select a Venn diagram to use. Then go through and see which criteria that outfall or that BMP qualifies for. And that will tell you if you're going to build a BMP or not. So I put an example for pretty much every situation here. Since we have limited time today, we won't go through those examples. However, the full set of slides will be posted with the recorded video. So I'll just skip through these slides. Okay, so let's go over how to put post-construction BMPs in the plans. For a structural BMP, include the information in the following sections. In the 1 series, on the cover page, include a note saying, this project contains post-construction BMPs. In the 2 series, for the index, include the 38 series in the index. In the 6 series, include the 169 pay items in the quantities. Don't include the 169 maintenance items, as those are not in use. In the 13 series, show the BMPs, label the BMP, provide stations for linear BMPs, such as bioslopes, show a maintenance access drive if applicable. You can find out if that's applicable in the drainage manual. Show fencing with a gate if applicable. Information on gates and fencing is also in the drainage manual. In the 17 series, include the driveway profile if there is a maintenance access drive. In the 18 series, include the landscaping plan if applicable. And the 19 series, include the BMP in the staging plans in the applicable stages. In the 21 series, include the BMP in the drainage area map. In the 22 series, include pipes going to the BMP in the drainage profiles. It is not necessary to include the outlet structure and the outlet pipe in the 22 series, if that profile is in the 38 series. In fact, it's best to only show the pipe profile once in the plans to avoid conflicting information in case there are any updates to that profile. In the 23 series, include the BMP in the cross sections. In the 24 series, include the BMP in the utility plans. In the 26 series, if there is a bioslope or bioretention basin, an enhanced dry swale, an enhanced wet swale, a sand filter, or a stormwater wetland, include signs identifying the location of the BMP, and make sure the signs are not located in the BMP itself. The signs should be near the BMP, but not inside of the BMP. Include the BMP in the 38 series. In the 53 series, include the BMP in the erosion control drainage area map. In the 54 series, include the BMP in the applicable stages. In the 60 series, include the BMP in the right-of-way plans. Here's some more information on how to put a BMP in the 38 series. Show all the information described in the published combined special grading sheets, which can be found on roads, and include the information in the PPG. Here are some highlights, but be sure to look at the PPG and the combined special grading sheets for additional instructions. So you should show a special grading plan overhead view. In the overhead view, show the econ file and the fcon file trimmed to each other. The econ file should be screened back and dashed to increase readability. Show contours for the BMP trimmed to the fcon and the econ file. Label contours at least every 5 feet in elevation change. Label the elevation and width of the top of the berm if the BMP is one that has a berm. Label the elevation and width of the emergency spillway if it's a BMP that has an emergency spillway. Include at least one spot elevation on the bottom of the BMP. Label side slopes, such as 4:1, 3:1, etc. Show the maintenance access drive if it has a maintenance access drive. Show fencing and a gate if it has the fencing and a gate. And be sure to show all the components described in Chapter 10 of the Drainage Manual for the specific BMP. Examples can include a riprap forebay, an outlet structure, a head wall, riprap, a low flow swale, an under drain, bypass structure, level spreader, aquatic bench, and/or safety bench. Fill out the applicable design data tables and include the blank as-built tables in the 38 series. If applicable, include the cross sections in the 38 series as shown in the combined special grading sheets. Check that the BMP component shown in the plan meet the drainage manual requirements and that the components match the published special construction details. Check that the BMP components shown in the plans match the accepted report. There'll be some situations where the dimensions or elevations might have changed since the accepted report, but the BMP type has stayed the same. If that's the case, that's okay. Just be sure to notify ODPS and inform us if the BMP will function comparably to the design in the accepted report. Include applicable details in the plan set. Here are some plan presentation tips. Follow the PPG. Existing contours should be grayed back and dashed. If text is overlapping, move labels to eliminate the overlapping. Print a PDF with sufficient time to observe and edit your own work before submitting. Here are some common mistakes which we have observed in plans. Inconsistency between plan sheets. Inconsistency between the report and the plan sheet. Missing information needed for construction. Plans which do not comply with the BMP component descriptions in the drainage manual. An example of a BMP component description in the drainage manual might be the berm and the 100-year elevation. It has to have a specific freeboard defined in the drainage manual. Another mistake would be a plan presentation which needs improvement. There could be general constructability or resiliency concerns. Modifying the details without ODPS is a mistake. If you think the BMP needs a project-specific detail modification, we'd be happy to help you out. Just notify us and we can modify the details for you. And then please don't specify sole source components. For Special Provision 169, it needs to be included for projects that have non-incidental BMPs that will be built. Special Provision 169 should be included with each milestone plan review and the construction contract. Email envbmp@dot.ga.gov or stormreport@dot.ga.gov for the most recent version of Special Provision 169. For projects that have non-incidental BMPs which will be built, include the 169 pay items and the construction contract, but do not include the post-construction BMP maintenance items, as those are not currently in use. For Ecology Stormwater Project Coordination, the main contacts will be your project ecologist, the agency representatives, and envbmp@dot.ga.gov. For Ecology Stormwater Policy or Procedure questions, the main contacts are Dave Fadine, myself, and Brian Stanfield. So if you would like some additional training, GDOT has published the Advanced Design Workshops on Roads through ELMS. ADWs, or Advanced Design Workshops, were published for MS4, but they may also be helpful for learning general stormwater concepts, particularly for those new to stormwater. ADWs 1, 3, 5, and 6 may be particularly helpful for those just getting used to stormwater. Please note that ADW2 is currently being updated to match our detention analysis procedure in the drainage manual. So at this time, please do not reference ADW2. Now I'll turn it back over to Brad McManus for the wrap up and key takeaways.
Brad, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. I thought I hit the on button. But anyway, thank you, Sarah, for that part of the presentation, and I'll go over the key takeaways here. The Ecology Post-Construction Stormwater Report, it facilitates coordination between the offices and agencies. It also enables practitioners to clearly uniformly document the resources and treatment targets. the coordination part allows us not to have the promises that are not kept. I think it's the part that I like to highlight there. The Ecology Post-Construction Stormwater template also establishes consistent expectations for the analysis process, so that's a good thing. And also for the presentation here, I want you to know exactly where to find information on the Ecology Post-Construction Stormwater reports, and that's going to be on the RoadsPed website, Design Manuals and Guides, Roadway, and you've got the help file and the template file there. Then also know when to prepare the report and know who prepares the report portion and each portion of the report. Thank you. Thanks. And I think we're going to turn it over to questions at this time. We'll give a few minutes for some questions.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. We've got a few questions that have come in, and the first one is for Dave. Do you only complete the, I guess that's column, or the attribute A table for those waters that have protected species habitat, or trigger FWCA, or do you complete it for every resource or every perennial stream? And Dave, you are muted.
Understandable. Yeah, attachment A is relevant when you have impacts to perennial streams or if you're bisecting high quality wetlands under the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act. So that's one of two triggering laws, so to speak, in terms of what's applicable. So perennial streams that may be impacted, high quality wetlands that may be bisected, those are your FWCA concerns. On the protected species side, under the Endangered Species Act or one of Georgia's state protected species laws, if you have suitable habitat for a species, and obviously aquatic habitat is what we're focused on here. So if you have suitable aquatic habitat for a species within a given project area, then you may also need to pursue attachment A. And so I think a critical difference there is that FWCA for perennials and wetlands is that the trigger is the anticipated impacts directly to those resources, which are 404 resources typically. Under the Clean Water Act, we need a permit for those. That's the same tie-in for FWCA initiation. When it comes to protected species, in certain instances, even if we don't have a direct footprint impact on a given aquatic resource, we may have concerns related to protected species if that resource is say an occupied resource by a federally protected fish, in which case we may also pursue some water quality treatment opportunities in the post-construction realm as well. But again, that somewhat complicates this because it's not the anticipation of a direct impact in the way that ecologists are usually approaching that question. So what ecologists are familiar with is how to analyze protected species effects, and those are the effects that will drive the decision as to whether or not a given resource that may not be a perennial stream, that may not be a high quality wetland, whether those other resources may still require or warrant some analysis in this vein. So does that answer the question, Chris? Do you have anything more to clarify beyond what I've said?
I think you covered it well.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. The next question I will direct towards Brad and Sarah. The Ecology Post-Construction Stormwater Report timeline with the A3M. Can you provide examples of the possible district construction and maintenance input?
I could take that one. So we'd really like to get the conversation started with district and construction at that point. We don't necessarily have any input that we would anticipate, but we would like to hear anything that they know about the location, their experiences with post-construction BMPs, any questions or concerns that they might have, and possibly their availability for different levels of maintenance.
Great, thanks, Sarah. This is an important one. Who is responsible for drafting the Ecology Post-Construction Stormwater Report?
So the first person that's going to get a hold of it will be, I guess, Ecology when they first start off in the A3M, and then drafting the report, as far as we're calling it a draft, will be done by the designer after it, and that'll be in the preliminary design phase. So it'll be handed off from the ecologist over to the designer in the design phase, and they'll be doing the drafting.
Great, thanks, Brad. And I think this may have been answered, but maybe just for clarification cases, does the Ecology Post-Construction Stormwater Report replace the regular Post-Construction Stormwater Report on projects where they are required? And then the second part of that is what triggers an Ecology PCSR, and I think that's something that Dave has already covered, so maybe just the first part of that for Brad or Sarah.
Yeah, I think the idea is that we would have the post-construction stormwater report be used for the for everything. In other words, if you're already in an MS4 area and you have an ecology resource, you'd still use the post-construction stormwater report, the MS4 post-construction stormwater report. It will cover it. It's just that if you have to actually do a BMP, let's say a BMP is maybe under MS4 would have been infeasible, but rather because of coordination, now it is something that an agency will require. Then it needs to be noted in the post-construction stormwater report that it is being built. It is found to be. We are actually placing it in the plans, and so. That just needs to be clearly documented in there.
Great, thank you. We're coming up on the end of our time, so just a couple of more questions. For fee negotiations, which fee estimate spreadsheet rows should include the ecologist and engineer Ecology Post-Construction Stormwater Report hours? And I'll just respond quickly for the ecology side. The ecology responsibilities are very, very basic. It's just putting resources into a couple of columns. Should hopefully take you 5-10 minutes. And so we're in the existing scope, but it is a much larger lift on the design side. And so I'll let Brad or Sarah speak to that.
Yes, could you repeat at least the gist of the question so I understand exactly? We're talking about the hours. Go ahead. I mean,
yeah. So for fee negotiations, as we're scoping and providing work hours for consultants, where should those hours be put on the scoping and work hours spreadsheet for the design work?
Okay, for the scoping, those are usually on the DS1 tab for the spreadsheets where those hours are placed, and usually we'll do the in-house, or I guess the GDOT in-house determination for those hours, but those are on the DS1 tab of that spreadsheet. That's the specific question.
Great. Thank you, Brad. And Brad, I think we've got one more question or one more minute. Do we have anything at the end that tells people where to go to get copies, to view this presentation or see the slides?
Yes, as a matter of fact. And I wanted to, I guess, tell you guys that here at the training, thank you, Sarah, here at the training website that we have posted here is where we have these presentations saved. And if we'll go to the next slide, please. And yeah, we just recently posted back June 23rd, we had the Section 20 plans and the construction envelope permitting part that was on there. This presentation will also be posted. And guys, I just want to remind you, go to the next slide, Sarah. Yeah, that's today's. That will be posted shortly. And then the next one will be the one on July 28th, where Sam Woods and David Dean will be giving you the perennial stream culvert requirements and the design and delivery strategies. So that is coming up. Also wanted to thank everybody. Thank Gail for organizing this. Thank you. And here's some information. Thank you, Sarah, on that anonymous attendees will not receive notice. So you do need to put in your, I think Chris had it earlier, put it into the chat. I think it was, put your information in the chat, or was it the website? I can't remember. But anyway, make sure we know who you are. And also want to thank Gail Davino. Thank you, Chris, for your presentation. Thank you, Dave, for yours, for Sarah, and special thanks to Ann Sexton-Paperno, who's no longer with us, but who did a great deal for this. And also like to thank Brian Stocks. Thank you for doing an excellent job of producing this. So I think you have to email the for request for PDH certificates, if I remember correctly, from the first part of this presentation. Is that right, Chris?
Yep. Email Gail Davina by July 30th, and don't wait longer because she will soon be retired. And many thanks to Gail for everything she's done for our program and for GDOT over the many years.
All right, thank you very much. I think that's about it, unless I know of anything, unless anybody has anything else to add.